Well, we'd like to welcome you all to another Sunday afternoon class from the BYU Library Family History Center. This is our new year, and we're starting off with another round of presentations this year. We now have more than 1,000 presentations on our BYU Library Family History Center YouTube channel, as well as on our website. So this has been a long journey for the last little bit more than 10 years, and we've done a lot of different kinds of webinars and classes over those years. Well, today we're going to talk about U.S. church records do exist and how to find your ancestors with church records. This is a topic that comes up almost always after people have looked in the standard death, marriage, birth record type searches and a few censuses and don't know where else you might find records. And especially happens when you have records from the birth records, for example, that were not kept by the states. Interestingly, not birth records were not kept in the United States consistently in most of the states until well into the 20th century. So you are looking at birth records that don't exist before 1900, and that is sometimes very difficult. But an alternative is that some of the churches actually recorded their births and if not birth, a baptism of their newly born members. And so we can use that information instead of using other information. So I'd just like to kind of emphasize this, that the churches and their records likely exist. You have to, the assumption you have to make in genealogy is that there's always more records. And then the next assumption you have to make is there's always going to be more records to find. So basically, you're going to take the position that there must be a record out there. Somebody must have had a record. It could have been a Bible, it could have been in a church, it could have been some other type of record, school records, just about everything where people would record the birth date of the person. So once you have that kind of frame of mind, then you can start looking. So the first kind of hurdle to overcome as you're working on getting church records is identifying the church. And one of the things that would be important to understand is that some of the people who came to America beginning clear back in the 1500s with the Spanish still have the religion of their grandfathers, their great-grandfathers, their traditional religion that goes back to the immigrants. And so identifying the immigrant as from a particular country may determine, and a time period may immediately tell you what church they belong to. If you say something like this, my immigrant came from Spain in the 1500s, then you're going to basically understand that that person was a Roman Catholic. And that's not a difficult jump to make. But if you have someone that came from England in the, say, 1800s, that may not indicate. Just by chance, it may be that they're Church of England, but they could be Methodist or a Presbyterian or a Baptist or some other denomination. So getting that information is the first sort of hurdle in determining whether or not you're going to have some information. And it's in my experience that very few people know the religion of their ancestors, with some specific exceptions. And when I ask people who are doing their research for the first time, what was their religion? And they look at me like, why would that matter? And why would I know that? And so for that purpose, you're wondering if it's even worthwhile to know that. But the answer to that, of course, is that we're really looking for additional records. We're not doing anything about making judgments about the person or or their beliefs or anything else. We just want to know where the records are. And the only way we know that is to find out, first of all, if they're their specific religion and whether that particular church kept records and if those records are available. And so those are kind of the steps you go through. And here we have the pilgrims. And the question I'd ask immediately, and you can answer this for yourself, or you can wait a little while I'm go through the presentation when I get back to this answer. So, do you know what church the pilgrims were part of, and what's it called today? Okay, so that's kind of the question in your back of your mind as I go through this presentation, and at some point I'll come back and tell this about specifically what it was. And just kind of to reinforce that issue is that very few people I've talked to know the denomination or church their grandparents belong to. They may know their general religion. So, for example, they may know that they're a Methodist, but do they know which Methodist church they attended and where that was? And the answer to that is almost invariably no. It can be even as even if it's a question being asked about someone who was a member of the Catholic Church, for example, knowing the particular parish that that person was attending church in is the crucial information for finding records about that particular person in the family. And so we get down to those questions that are even a little bit more and sometimes difficult to resolve. In 1900, according to the available data, this is the quotes there from PBS, around 97.1% of the US population belonged to a church. So, from this standpoint, we look at what's happening today. The share of Americans who were not a member of a church or synagogue has been increasing since 1992. That means people are leaving churches and been in increasing numbers since 1992. In 2023, about 55% of Americans were not members of a church or a synagogue. In that same year, 45% of Americans were members of a church or synagogue. And there's a long URL address of where this came from on Statistica. So what does this mean? It means that it's more and more common that not only do they not know the church that their parents, grandparents, or whatever belong to, they don't even know, they don't have their own church to even start with talking to their church to see if their parents, if there are records for some reason with their own church, because they don't have a church. And the effect that has on genealogy from just a genealogical and not talking about politics or sociology or anything else, the culture or whatever, is that there are no longer going to be produced a very useful number of church records that will help people in the future to do research. But you can tell from those statistics that chances are your ancestors belong to a church. Now, some of the churches, like those in Catholic countries primarily, and some of the Protestant companies, like the ones with the Lutheran Church, became and are still the state church. And in the case of England, for example, the Church of England is, since 1538, has been the state church of England. And that gave some advantages to the people who belong to the church and some distinct disadvantages to the people who did not belong to the church. And what I've seen in my own family is that my ancestors wanted to immigrate. Well, I don't know whether they wanted to, but they were asked to immigrate to Australia. So why was that? No, they weren't criminals. No, they weren't arrested. No, they weren't shipped there. as criminals as many of the early people to Australia were, and to the United States, I might add, that there were percentage-wise as many or more people who were sent to America and the Caribbean islands and subsequently came to America, to the United States, who were sent here as criminals. But in this particular case, the parish where the family lived was not in a position and did not want to create a poorhouse. And my people were dirt poor. So basically, they had an option, and the option was they could emigrate, leaving England, and go to Australia. And I suppose they chose to do that. But the condition was that they then had to be baptized into the Church of England, because that was one of the requirements of having the immigration take place. And so what you find in this particular instance is a baptismal record of the entire family on the same date. So when things like that begin to happen, when you're doing research, you can begin to see that the church records interests are sometimes determined by the politics and the, let's call it, predominant religion of the community in which they live. And if your ancestors happen to be in a minority, and that minority didn't happen to belong to the majority church, then there's even more restrictions, difficulties, and things that happen that may create even more interesting things to try to find as we're doing genealogical research. So, in order to do this, you'll need to know the denomination and the location to search for records. Now, that might be not as difficult as it seems. If you have, and let's start out with a rather simple kind of situation. You have ancestors that lived in the United States, and they lived predominantly between 1850. The ones you're interested in are after 1850, or at least parts of their lives are after 1850, and they are therefore going to show up in the US Census records. So anyone who shows up in a census record then has automatically given you information that may help you find the church they belong to. And that is by going to the census record, you can get their address, or the almost exact, if not exact, location where the person lived. That's on the census records, and you're able to find that. That's another class and another consideration, but finding that is available. So then you can put that information into Google, for instance, doing a Google Maps search of the place. This place, I just chose Akron, Ohio as a place. And what I did was I typed in to Google Maps, I put Akron, Ohio, and you get a map of Akron, Ohio. So this is what this is Akron, Ohio. And then you put in the word churches. And the Google Maps will then populate the maps with all the churches that are available on that map. And if your people lived in close proximity to one of those churches, or possibly if you, for instance, identified in this case, if they were Catholics and they lived in this area, the great chances are, because of the way the Catholics do their membership by geographic location of the members, they would be part of St. Bernard Catholic Church, which is listed on the map with a little cross, and then also in the list of churches on the left-hand side of the map search. It's down about to the bottom, third from the bottom, it says St. Bernard Catholic Church. So now you have two things. You know where they lived in a particular year, and you know with possibly what church they belong to. Now that may be only part of the equation that you're looking for, because records in the Catholic Church and many records in the Protestant churches are kept at the parish level. That would be the smallest division of the church. And that small division of the church would have a priest or equivalent, a pastor, a minister, a priest. And the fact that St. Bernard Church was the closest church did not mean that St. Bernard was a parish church. It may be just a church, meaning that there were not enough members to have a parish, and so somewhere else there's a parish. So part of this process is going to be learning a lot about, and a lot more than you may know now, about the structure and how the churches are found, and then the methodology for finding where the records might have been kept or where they are today from almost any church. And so this is the type of information. Now, what does this mean? This means that you're getting into real, what we would call real genealogical research. It's not just clicking on a button on Family Search and getting a record that pertains to your person. The issue here is that you have to know how to do this information for each church, because each church is going to be slightly different, maybe completely different, on how they keep the records, where they keep the records, and who kept the records. And so once that you have this kind of concept that you can get records from the Catholic Church or from the Congregational Church or from something other one of the ones listed here, you can see there's lots of different churches. And you may find out, if you go back in time, that the people changed churches. So some of the listed churches in this list in Akron, Ohio, are probably churches that have a particular date of original organization for the church. So that would be an important thing to know. If it's something like a Catholic church or like a Lutheran church or Presbyterian or Methodist, it probably goes clear back to the Reformation, back in the early days, and the churches that spun off from the original Catholic and Catholic churches in Europe. Okay, another thing is important is that your people may likely have lived very close to a church. This is something that stretches beyond the boundaries of the United States. But in my experience, during my lifetime, I know that the friends that I've had and you lived attended a church that was reasonably close to where they lived. And in fact, people of a certain religion would congregate in certain parts of the city. And I grew up in a western town, and primarily in Phoenix, Arizona, and that was certainly true in Phoenix, Arizona, because there was places where nearly everybody was Catholic in the town, and there were places where they were all Jewish, and there were other places where it was a mixture of Protestant churches. So those kinds of things are also important in locating and understanding where the records may have been kept as you go through this. This next step here is to learn about the history of your ancestors' church. That's extremely important. And what you have is a possibility that the records that you have are not current. In other words, your church history, like this church history of New England, was from 1602 to 1804. Now, that sounds like it's really old, but it's not very far back in your genealogy if you're going back by generations. In 3 or 4 generations from my age group, and maybe more from someone who is considerably younger than I am. But eventually what you're going to find is that you're back into this type. And this is an account of the Baptists in the southern parts of America. And knowing this may very well give you information as to what was the possible church that your or religion that your ancestors practiced. So in the course of doing this, you'll learn a little bit about the bats, or maybe a lot about the individual religions that you do research for. And what we know from a thing called cluster research, and cluster research means that people have live in areas where they have affinity with their surroundings. People are unlikely to move into an area where they are completely different from everybody else in that area. It doesn't, it happens. It is, but long run, and especially further back you go in time, people were more comfortable with their denominations, living close to their church, living in the same proximity to those who believed the same way that they did. And it's important to see that this carried over to an extreme extent as people traveled to the colonies and to America over the time and subsequently to the United States. And that is that Quakers, for example, founded Pennsylvania. And so there are a larger percentage of people who profess to be Quakers in that particular state. If we go to the next state, Catholics were present in the middle colonies. That meant you're more likely to find Catholics in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and those states on the East Coast than you would find them in other parts of the country. Not that there were no Catholics elsewhere. There were Catholics in all the major cities of the United States. And when both the Italians and the Irish came in great numbers to places like Boston and New York, then it changed the composition of those particular locations, and they became more Catholic and or particular type of Protestant. Lutherans were also present in the middle colonies. Now, this is kind of a rule of thumb. In other words, it's a rule that says if your ancestors turned out to be from the middle colonies, meaning North and South Carolina predominantly, then their possibilities were more that they were Catholics or Lutherans than it would be if they were something else. And Jews are also present in the middle colonies. One of the things that forces all this to happen is that the pilgrims who came to the area in the Massachusetts Bay Colony were very, very, very exclusive of having any other religions. And in fact, if they were Quakers, they were thrown out of the colonies. And if they were anything else, they were thrown out of the colonies. And then where did they go? Well, one of the places they went to is where my ancestors came from, and that is in Rhode Island, which would take anybody from any religion, and they didn't care. They didn't have any kind of restrictions on religion. So those were the types of things that would, in a sense, dictate where that person happened to be and happened to end up when they immigrated here to America. Baptists were and still are extremely prevalent in the southern colonies. So if people came to Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, or any of those places, then it's very, very likely that they were Baptists. And if they weren't Baptists, there was only a few other particular religions that would have had any kind of ascendancy in those areas. Anglicans, also in the southern colonies. That means Anglicans is a reference to the Church of England. We call them Episcopalians, who are the Anglicans or Church of England. Here in the United States, called Episcopalians. In the past, some church organizations kept records of their members that included the dates of birth, marriages, and deaths, and others did not. My particular ancestors in Rhode Island belonged to what was called a Seventh-day Baptist church. A very interesting sect. And you would think that, well, this is something that they had back in the old days. Well, driving around in the eastern part of the United States and doing some trips we've taken back there, we're always looking at the churches, and there's lots and lots of churches, and it's interesting to see what they're called. And the Seventh-day Baptists are have churches in the eastern part of the United States. But what happened in that church was they did not record the births or the deaths of any of their members. They simply kept membership lists. So looking for that person in those churches may confirm the existence of the person and their name and their membership in the Seventh-day Baptist Church, but it doesn't help you finding their birth or death date, except for the fact that if you look at the records over time, you may see that they appear suddenly and then they disappear suddenly. And that could be an indication that they were either joining the congregation at a certain age and then leaving the congregation, or being born or died. And in other circumstances, the people, for example, in the same congregations, the Seventh-day Baptists, were not particularly interested in baptizing or having people join until they were had quite some age. There's a comment in the chat that says it's interesting that America was founded on religious freedom, yet here we're talking about religious segregation. Well, you have to remember that the religious freedom part of the United States came in 1776 and so up to 1782 and so forth, with the passage of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. That's when we got religious freedom. Before that time, going back into the 1600s with the advent of the Pilgrims and others, there was rampant segregation of religions and persecution of religions. So, yeah, this is the history. And if you want the pragmatic sort of strong position that I take, is that most of the development of the United States in the early days, what we call the colonies, was based on real estate and real estate promotion, and had little or nothing to do with the people's religion. So that may not be what you learned in school or what you thought, but it's pretty interesting when you get into the history. In 1800, for example, there were 35,000 Catholics in the United States. That's a pretty small number of Catholics. By 1900, 100 years later, the Catholic population was 10 million. So how did that happen? What happened in the 1800s to increase the number of Catholics to 10 million? So there you go. So now you're looking at another aspect of the importance of not only understanding what religion it was, but putting that religion into the context of the historical things that were happening. So let's look at a couple of things. One is between 1800 and 1900, there was a huge famine in Ireland. We call it the potato famine, and it was right around the 1850s, 1850 to 52, in that range. But before that time, there were always famines going on in Ireland. And so there's estimates of 1 million of people coming to the United States just all at once from Ireland. And the predominant religion of these people was Catholic. Now, if they came from the northern part of Ireland, and that's a more complicated history because the native Irish had been driven out of the northern part of Ireland by the English, and the English had established the plantation systems as much as they could in Ireland, and the English brought over Scottish and English workers, farmers, to be tenant farmers on their plantations. And those were the people that lived there, and they were Church of England and Protestants. So what you find predominant in Northern Ireland is Presbyterians from Scotland. And Presbyterianism is basically another name for the Church of Scotland. So once you get into this history, you begin to understand that the connection between your ancestors and their church and their history is going to determine if you can find records. And when you do find records, you'll find that they have something to do with either the history of where your ancestors were or their religion. This is another interesting part of it. So when you get into the history of the churches and you read on some sort of record that says that your ancestor was a Catholic, that doesn't really tell you everything. You may immediately assume that they were Roman Catholic. Well, there are, and some of you may know this, but there are 23 churches that are in full communion with the Roman Catholic Pope, but have their own distinct liturgical traditions, languages, and cultural heritage. They're often referred to as Catholic churches of the East. And we may think that they are sort of all the Eastern Orthodox Catholic Church. And the answer to that is there are 23 of these, not just one. And here's the list of them. So these are all the different Catholic churches. And some of these churches, like the Coptic Catholic Church, have their own pope and are not directly associated with the Catholic Church in Rome. And so as you go down this list, any one of these people from any one of these countries and any one of these particular religions could just simply be listed as a Catholic. And if you think about it for a while, you may think, well, yeah, I think we had a Greek Catholic church in our town, or I think we have a Byzantine church, or I don't know what that other one was. So it's very possible that your ancestors, even though they were Catholics, were not core Catholic from Rome and the Roman Catholic Church, which of course was tremendously in the majority, the vast majority in most of what you would call Romance speaking languages, countries that spoke languages of Romanian, Italian, Spanish, French, and so forth. And they are also countries where the Reformation, which was Martin Luther and Lutheranism that arose, did not really become effective. They were more to the north, and we think of Lutherans as being from Germany and other countries associated around Germany, and particularly with the Scandinavian countries. Understanding this is that all these churches can have people in the United States who are members of these churches. So we're looking at a little bit more searching. And when we get down to it, there are more than 65 Baptist denominations in the United States, and the actual number may be even higher due to the autonomy of local churches. So when you get into the structure of one of the churches, a Baptist church or any of the other churches that we would think of as Protestant churches, the Protestant churches have a variety of different structures and a variety of different methods of keeping records and the records and where those records were kept. And not all of those records are centralized. And maybe the records, if you find them, are still going to be in that church if that church has had a continuity from the time that your ancestors were there. And when I say that church, I mean that building, the building where the people are attending church. So there are more than 65 different denominations. So where do we get going when we start? Where we go is to the Family Search Research Wiki, and we look under church records, and we go to any one of the states in the United States, for example, and the focus of this discussion is on records that we would look for here in the United States with people coming from all the countries bringing their religions. And so here we go with a look at Virginia church records, and you'll look down the list and you'll see that there are some online records for different denominations. And the question is, how do you get started? Well, first of all, you've got to go back to what I started with initially, and that is you've got to locate an exact location of where your family lived or the person you're looking for lived during their lifetime. And so when you look for that particular location, then you have to, and you find out that they were associated with a particular church, then you have the basis for getting into these kinds of situations and looking for the records which may have been kept about that person in that particular church. And Family Search has extensive records for churches in the United States. These are wiki articles for the church records in each of the states. So when you go to the familysearch.org research wiki under the search tab and you start looking at church records and reading about the church records, you'll see that this will take you down to each individual state in the union and give you some very good background on which churches, what were the churches that were predominantly available in that particular state. So I might also mention that Ancestry.com also has some extensive church records. Here we have listed on this card catalog entry, which is where we look to find all the records that exist on Ancestry. And if you go to Ancestry and you go to search, at the bottom you'll find the card catalog, and that will take you here, and you'll see a list of all of their collections. And fully, a very important set of collections on Ancestry are church records. Once again, you can only connect your person to begin looking through these records once you identify the person's religion and the place where they were living and the church they may have attended. One other important part is on Find My Past. Now, historically, for a lot of different reasons, the Catholic Church was not going to give their records to Family Search. And I'm not going to go through that discussion of why that happened or how that happened. But within the last 3 or 4 years, maybe a little longer, Find My Past, which is the British company, has begun to develop a relationship with the diocese, the bigger Catholic organization. Parishes are the local level, diocese or a bishop in a group of parishes, and they have been able to get in and copy and digitize millions upon millions, and they're still doing it, of U.S. Catholic Church records. So if your people turn out to be Catholic in the United States, it's a good idea to begin searching and Find My Past, because Find My Past may have those records those Catholic Church records that no one else has. This is kind of a unique collection with them. At some point, you're going to have to break out of the now traditional online genealogical resources and go out to the digital resources from all the other places that aren't really identified as genealogical resources. They're just simply resources, and they are available. So you have here, for example, the website. I have the URL for that website. And this is the Southern Baptist Historical Library and Archives. And they have digital resources. And down there, there's African American Baptist resources and annuals and other things that are in the Southern Baptist Historical Library and Archives in Nashville, Tennessee. So if you are pursuing this research in the South, you may find out that what you've been looking for is very difficult simply because of the way the records were kept in the South. But here's another avenue of finding information about a family or about even an African American family that you may not be aware of. Baylor University, Department of Religion, has Baptist historical archives and collections, and they have them from all sorts of places, Georgia, different places. And then this is the URL, but basically the names. As you go through these, if you're interested in finding the information from a presentation like the class, once this video recording is uploaded and it's on either the YouTube or on the BYU library website, then you can stop the video and get the information. And it's easier, by the way, than trying to write and do down the URL to just simply put in Baylor University Department of Religion. And that would get you to this particular part of the website. Now we're looking also at another organization that's called the American Baptist Historical Society, and they have collections. Of course, they will do research for you if you want to pay them, but basically this one has to do with Baptist missionary movements and also by resources documenting African American church associations and other movements. And they said their resources include more than 80,000 volumes and 225,000 periodicals, pamphlets, and manuscripts. So these are substantial church collections. The archives of the Episcopal Church, another archive. Now, you may find that the archives, in a sense, are focused on more on the organization and history of the general church rather than us naming individuals. And that's something that you have to determine by looking. As I mentioned initially, some churches didn't keep information particularly about the individual members, and others did. Catholics, for example, were extremely careful in documenting all the members they had and recording the sacraments and the of baptism and marriage and the burials and all of that information. Here's another one, the Santa Clara University Archives and Special Collections. At one point in time, I was doing research when someone came to me and they said, the only thing I know about my family is I have this photo of my grandmother and her children, and I have her name. And that's all they knew. And from that, we were able to track that family back through their various things that had happened to them. And they ended up living in California. And then they moved even further back in California. And they were originally Catholics. And we were able to find them in the mission records in Southern California and took that record clear back into the 1800s and earlier. And that's all from just a picture and a name. And so that was using church records and also Social Security records and military draft records. Those were the key crucial ones for finding these people. So here's the California Mission Records collection. And the Mission Record collection happens to be in the Huntington, which is the most prominent collection of Western Americana collections. It's the Huntington Library. And I don't know if you've ever visited the Huntington, but it's a very impressive place to visit. And the Huntington Gardens that surround it are also are magnificent. And for me, have been one of the highlights of my trips to the Los Angeles area. Unfortunately, right now, Los Angeles is probably under siege from the fires, but the Huntington is still in existence and still outside of the fires. Now we're going to answer your question. This is the Congregational Library, and it has over 400 years of congregational records. And guess what? This is the Church of the Pilgrims. This is the church that's still today active and viable here in the United States. And it's the same church that was brought to America by the Pilgrims and when they landed in Massachusetts, what would become Massachusetts. And the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has a substantial archives called the Church History Library. And many, many records from the Church History Library are now being digitized and made available to anyone who wants to go online and read those records. They are extensive and more records are being added constantly. So one thing that you're going to learn very quickly is that you just don't walk into these collections like the Huntington and ask to do research. You may very well have to communicate with the library in advance and have the prerequisite requirements that you fulfill the requirements of a person that they're going to allow to come in and do research. So you may have to do some preparation, and that means individual preparation, either through training or schooling or whatever, before you can even get access to some of these records. And so it's not as easy and as quick and fast as you might presume. Getting a reader's card in the Library of Congress is a process, and getting a reader's card at the U.S. National Archives is a process. And you can assume that any other library or archive is going to have that kind of requirement for a way to get those records. And most of these are going to end up being closed stacks. What means is that you don't just go in and start pulling books off the shelf. You have to search in the catalog and kind of guess what you'd like to see, and then have them pull the book and bring it out for you to look at. And then if you don't find it, or if you do find what you want, you may have to take whatever process they allow to make copies or of whatever of that particular record. So the point here is that church records and many other records are not found solely on genealogy websites. We have billions of records on the websites, and it's amazing. And compared to when I started doing research many years ago, it's fantastic. But we have to understand that there's still these huge archives and repositories for records that may or may not have some degree of the records that were kept. One example of this is an interesting example because it has to do with a huge Latin American population. The Spanish Empire, until the mid-1800s, when all of the countries began to revolt and threw off Spanish rule, was there for virtually 300 to 400 years. And during that time, the only church available was the Catholic Church. And the records of the Catholic Church are tremendous depth and tremendous amount of records. And how did they occur? Well, during the empire, the missions of the church, meaning those churches outside of the main areas where the Spanish were dominant, basically had to make 3 copies of their records. So they made a copy for their own records in the parish, and then they had a copy that they had to send to Mexico City, and then they had another copy that was sent to Spain. And all of those records that were sent from Latin America to Spain are in the archives of the Indies, which is the archives in Seville. And some of those records, and more all the time, are being digitized and made available. My answer, of course, to that is good luck. It's a very hard way to get into it, but there are records of that nature. And to emphasize this, that the church records may contain vital information about your family. It's just basically something that you need to be aware of and be able to get into. And especially with the large number of church records that are available. This is from Family Search, just in one part in Pennsylvania records. But you have to know the church before you can find the records. And so that's the key, and that's what I've tried to get. So keep looking, and thanks for watching.